The author of the book of Kohelet captured the dualities of life, the polarities within which we operate. And amongst those, he lists Eit lasot milchama, Eit l'shalom, that there is a time for war and a time for peace. What we struggle with is how these conflicting values of war and peace interact with each other. As the conflict between Israel and Hamas continues, it's appropriate for us to take a moment to discuss how we make war, how we make peace. It's clear from the Torah that peace is Judaism's highest aspiration. The Midrash and the Talmud both emphasize that the entirety of Torah is based on the value of peace. So much so that there are midrashim that discuss how the obligation to seek peace is greater than ritual observances. And it notes that many of the commandments of the Torah are phrased in conditional terms. If you see this happening, then you must act. If the circumstances are such, then respond in the following way. If you meet, if you come across, they're conditional statements operative in only specific situations. But the imperative of peace is greater. Bakei shalom v'radfehu. One is obligated and expected to search for peace and pursue it. In order to maintain peaceful relations between individuals, we're allowed to compromise on other moral and religious values. In order to prevent strife between people, the Gemara tells us that we may even resort to lying. Our Parsha this week, the part that we didn't read, has God himself telling a little white lie in which he changes what Sarah said in his recounting of the event to Abraham so as to preserve shalom bayit, harmony, peace in their home. It's clear from the array of laws on the subject that one is expected to bend over backwards to make peace. In the Gemara in Shabbat, it tells us that it is a mark of piety if a person accepts insults quietly without responding, that a true scholar is humble and ignores the slights made about them by others. Grace and mercy are seen as divine attributes meant to be emulated by human beings. Clearly, peace is a paramount value in Judaism. But how do we apply that value in the face of aggression? Some have argued through the years that pacifism is the appropriate response because it has the advantage of being uncompromising, categorical, and absolute. Pacifists retain their love for peace without sullying their hands with violent actions. And considering our tradition's strong emphasis on peace, it is a view that has to be taken somewhat seriously. The two major arguments for pacifism are as follows. One is consequentialist and assumes that in the long run, the world will be more peaceful if individuals and groups choose to remain passive in the face of aggression. second argument is moral, which claims that violence is absolutely forbidden no matter what the circumstances. Consequentialists posit that if you're defending yourself with violence, you perpetuate an endless cycle of violence. Consequentialists see nonviolent protest as a way of ending this cycle. According to this argument, responding to the attacks by Hamas will only create future violent reactions, and that Israel would be better off taking a moral high ground and remain a passive victim, ultimately convincing the aggressors, Hamas, that their stance is immoral. This idea is not new within our tradition. Josephus, in his book, The Jewish War, cites a speech by King Agrippa, who was the king of Judea during the Jewish revolt of 66, in which he exhorted the crowd to remain patient. He says, "Nothing so much damps the force as strokes the bearing of them with patience, and the quietness of those who are injured diverts the injurious persons from afflicting." The view could be distilled into the Schweig still, stay quiet view of pacifism. It assumes that people will receive goodwill if they remain meek, passive, and useful. The rabbis of the Talmudic period were relatively in agreement that revolting against Rome was a tragic mistake. That the tactic of Schweig still, be quiet, would have been better for the Jewish people. And it is an idea that has often been used by Jews in anti-Semitic societies in which they've lived, where they avoided making waves, offering cooperation and compliance to those in authority. But this approach ultimately has its limitations. There are times when remaining passive is beyond inappropriate and approaches the ridiculous. An old Jewish joke that perhaps encapsulates that. Two Jews are about to be executed by a firing squad. As they're handed their blindfolds, one of the Jews refuses to put his on. The second one, mortified by this act of rebellion, turns to his friend and says, "Psst, don't make trouble." The Schweig-Still form of pacifism was perhaps a reasonable approach for a powerless people, but it seems absurd for a nation like Israel to remain completely nonviolent, allowing all who attack it to do so with impunity. Pacifists argue that even Israel and other world powers should embrace nonviolence and refuse to offer any resistance to those who attack them. They argue that nonviolence, by virtue of its moral authority, can be successful, and most of them like to point the finger at Gandhi, who succeeded in getting Britain to leave India through nonviolent protest. But as Michael Walzer, in his book, Just and Unjust Wars, writes, Gandhi succeeded because he was opposing a British Empire that was tired, weakened after World War II, and he was opposing an empire that had a tradition of respect for human rights and human beings. It would have been completely ineffective in other instances. For the 6 million Jews murdered in Europe, Gandhi had no practical advice. He advised Rabbi Leo Beck, the leader of German Jewry during the Shoah, that he should get all German Jews to commit mass suicide and that this would focus the world's attention on Hitler's inhumanity. Not helpful advice. Rabbi Beck replied that we Jews know that it is God's singular commandment to live so that we can be exemplars of God in the world. And we know that no amount of nonviolent protest would have done anything to change the evil in Hitler's heart and in his war against the Jews. No amount of passivity will change the murderous intent of Hamas. The second type of pacifism, moral pacifism, assumes that it is morally forbidden to use violence even in self-defense. And people often point to the nonviolent Buddhist teachings of the Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, who received the 1989 Nobel Peace Prize. Exiled from Tibet, his homeland, he preached a principled form of nonviolence to his followers in Tibet, asserting that because violence can only breed more violence and suffering, our struggle must remain nonviolent and free of hatred. It is not, however, a practical weapon against one's enemies. In Jewish tradition, self-defense is also a moral obligation. The Torah allows people to defend themselves and their property from a thief and a murderer, even if this will cause the conflict to escalate. If there is a reason to assume that even the thief will use lethal force in his attempt to seize your property, the owner may use physical force and even kill the thief if necessary to protect himself and his home and his family. There are two rationales for allowing self-defense. The first is practical. Without the ability to use lethal force to stop the actions of aggressors, anarchy would ensue. And the second challenges the moral assumption of nonviolence. It asserts that it is impossible to equate the lives of the aggressor and the victim. We have as a rule that God's quest is in the interest and in the support of the hunted. The life of the aggressor and the victim are not of equal value. If only one can survive, it is our obligation to make sure that it is the innocent person, the one who is being victimized, who will survive. For this reason, Jewish tradition considers pacifism in the face of aggression to be immoral. Refusing to fight evil means that we become party to evil itself. Over 20 years ago, Michael Kelly wrote in the Washington Post in the weeks after the 9/11 attacks that no honest person could pretend that the groups that attacked America will, if let alone, not attack again. Nor can any honest person say that this attack is not at least reasonably likely to kill thousands upon thousands of innocent people. To not fight in this instance is to let the attackers live to attack and murder again. To be a pacifist in this instance is to accept and in practice support this outcome. In his paragraph, change America to Israel, and you have the reality of today. If you do not help the victims, if you do not fight against evil, then you become an ally of the aggressor. Peace is our paramount value. Yet at times we know we have to make war. It feels like a paradox. Somehow we are to love peace even as we are making war. It means that we should never lose sight of the humanity of our enemies and recognize that every death on the battlefield is tragic. That the death of innocence is tragedy before our eyes and God's. The Talmud teaches us that on the night that the Egyptian army drowned in the Red Sea, the first moment of true freedom for the Jews, we're told that the Israelites sang the song at the sea. Hearing them sing, the angels seek to take up the song and praise God, and God tells them to shut up. And what? We're simply joining the Jewish people in praising you. For them, this is a moment of liberation. For them, this is the redemption from enemies who have persecuted them. But you live up here with me. You stand in the presence of God all the time. Don't you understand that those are my people drowning? Want to sing? It's not a moment of joy in God's world when the death, the enemy, is a necessity. Every human created in God's image means their death is a tragedy. The then Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, was often quoted as saying that she could forgive the Arab countries for killing Jewish children, but that she could never forgive the Arab countries for making it necessary for Jews to kill Arab children. The warrior must mourn the death of his enemy and the innocents who are caught up in the conflagration and never forget the value of life. A soldier's love for peace will affect his wartime behavior. The old adage, all is fair in love and war, could be no further from a Jewish truth. Despite what we see in the news and on the headlines, Israel and its soldiers still make every effort to avoid killing non-combatants. The concern with collateral damage is abundant, and too has its roots in our Parashat this week, as Abraham pleads with God to avoid killing any righteous citizens who might be living in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah about to be destroyed. Abraham argued that even though God was destroying these places because they were profoundly evil, that justice demanded that God avoid killing any righteous individual while doing so. So, descendants of Abraham, even as we are required and obligated to engage in war, we are warned to be careful never to destroy more than is necessary, despite the violence inherent in battle, and to endeavor to preserve every living being whenever possible. Some years ago, the New York Times printed a little snippet of an article about a town that the IDF had entered in order to root out some snipers in a terror cell that was operating from Beit Jala. The reporter says that as he went from house to house with some of the people returning, he found a note left by the IDF soldiers in the hands of a teddy bear. In imperfect English, the note said, "We are truly sorry for the mess we made in your home." Those soldiers understood that peace remains Judaism's paramount value, and that war, when necessary, is messy and tragic. Every Israeli soldier, whether they're actively in battle or waiting to go into battle, want nothing more than in the core of their being, they hope and pray for Isaiah's vision to come true, when swords will be beaten into plowshares and nations will not lift up sword against nation ever again, that each person can sit in tranquility and in peace, surrounded by their family and their loved ones. Amen. Chaverim, let me invite you to return to our Sidurim, and we continue with the Chatzi Kaddish on page 184, which introduces